To make a buttonhole, measure the length of the buttonhole by placing the button on top of the fabric. Mark the top and bottom of the button. This button will be sewed underneath the buttonhole. With a ruler, mark a straight line from the top and bottom points. This line will be used to guide the sewing machine when sewing the buttonhole. Set the sewing machine to sew a buttonhole, first selecting a short stitch. On this sewing machine, the buttonhole stitch length is indicated between 0 and 1. The dial with the indicators 1, 2, 3, and 4 are used to sew the buttonhole. First, select number 1 to sew the first column of the buttonhole. Place the fabric that is marked to draw the buttonhole underneath the presser foot. Insert the needle directly into the center of the line drawn for the buttonhole at the top marking. Begin sewing using your hands to guide the fabric straight down the line. Stop at the mark that indicates the bottom of the buttonhole. Make sure the needle is in the fabric, then turn the knob to select number 2 for the buttonhole stitch. Continue sewing, letting the needle zigzag side to side about 3 times. Place the needle in the fabric and change the selector to number 3. Continue sewing. This time the stitch will stitch backwards. Use your hands to guide the fabric so it stitches in a straight line. Be careful not to push or pull the fabric, letting the feed dogs do the work. When you reach the end of the column where the beginning of the buttonhole started, stop. Turn the stitch selector knob to number 4. Then continue stitching, letting the needle zigzag back and forth 3 times. Lift the presser foot and remove the fabric from the sewing machine. Trim all of the threads around the buttonhole. Puncture the center of the buttonhole with small scissors or a seam ripper, cutting all the way through the center of the buttonhole. Careful not to cut any of the stitch lines. Open the buttonhole and carefully trim the excess fabric around the inside of the buttonhole. To sew the button onto the corresponding piece of fabric, place the fabric with the buttonhole cut on top of the fabric. Draw a line through the center of the buttonhole. This indicates where the button should be sewn on. Place the button on top of the fabric. Careful to align the holes of the button in the direction that they are meant to go. Thread a needle, pull both ends together, and tie a knot at the end of the needle. Wrapping the thread around the forefinger and rolling it with the thumb is an easy way to overlap the threads, then pull them into a knot. Hold the button to the fabric. Bring the needle into the fabric from the back through one buttonhole. Pull the needle all the way through the buttonhole until the knot on the thread stops in the back. Bring the needle from the front to the back into the next buttonhole. Then bring the needle from the back to the front into the next buttonhole. This pattern is stitching from the bottom right corner to the top left corner, then from the top right corner to the bottom left corner. This pattern will continue the entire time stitching the button onto the fabric. Repeat this pattern 3 to 4 times to create a secure stitch for the button onto the fabric. After the button is stitched onto the fabric, push the needle from the back of the fabric to the front of the fabric, tilting the button so the needle only goes through the fabric and does not come above the button. Use the thread to wrap around all of the stitches that attach the button to the fabric, pulling the fabric back and letting the button hang off. Wrap around 10 times. This creates a column around the stitches, giving some space between the button and the fabric. When the button is placed into the buttonhole, this space is needed for the fabric around the buttonhole. Pulling the thread taut, push the needle through the column that was created by wrapping the thread. Tie a knot, placing the thread through the loop of the fabric. Place the needle through the loop twice to tie a secure knot. Knot once again before cutting the thread. Once the thread is knotted, trim the thread, then the button is ready to use in the buttonhole.